Episode 1, 73 seconds. The screen shows a perfect blue sky over Cape Canaveral, Florida. It is the morning of January 28, 1986. Thousands of spectators watch from the stands of the Kennedy Space Center. The Challenger shuttle rises majestically, leaving a white trail against the intense blue. Families applaud. Children point to the sky. Everything seems perfect, but exactly 73 seconds after takeoff, at 11:39 a.m. Eastern Time, the world watches in horror as the Challenger explodes in an orange and white fireball. The contrail forks in two directions, forming a deadly Y against the sky. Silence replaces the applause. Cameras capture faces frozen in shock. A mother cries. A father hugs his child. In the NASA control room, engineers sit motionless in front of their screens. 7 astronauts. 7 lives. All gone in an instant. This is the story of how the world's most prestigious space agency got to this point. But more importantly, this is the story of what really caused the disaster, of the ignored warnings, of the decisions made under pressure, and of how ambition and politics can cost lives. Because what the world saw that day was no accident. It was the inevitable result of a chain of decisions that began long before, in offices filled with documents, in meetings where warnings were ignored, in an organizational culture that prioritized image over safety. Fast forward 6 months. It's the summer of 1985. At the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, 7 people are training for what will be the STS-51L mission, the 25th mission of the Space Shuttle program. The commander is Francis Richard Scobie, a 46-year-old man with military experience as a pilot. His face reflects the seriousness and professionalism that characterize him. At his side is pilot Michael John Smith, 40, who will be on his first space flight. His eyes shine with the excitement of someone about to fulfill his lifelong dream. The crew includes 3 mission specialists. Judith Resnick, a brilliant 36-year-old electrical engineer who flew in space in 1984. Ronald McNair, a 35-year-old African-American physicist, jazz saxophonist, an example of self-improvement. And Ellison Onizuka, a 39-year-old aerospace engineer, Japanese descent. Then there's Gregory Jarvis, 41, a payload specialist engineer, and the person who will make this mission unique in the eyes of the world. Sharon Krista McAuliffe, 37, a high school teacher from Concord, New Hampshire. Krista isn't a professional astronaut. She's an ordinary citizen selected from more than 11,000 applicants for the Teacher in Space program, an initiative by President Ronald Reagan designed to reconnect the American public with the space program. She will teach classes from space, broadcast live to millions of students across the United States. Cameras follow her constantly. She smiles radiant. "I can't teach him, and I can't wait," she says in an interview. Her students in New Hampshire are counting down the days. For them, for the entire country, Krista represents the democratization of space. If a teacher can go, perhaps anyone can. But what they don't know is that their presence has added immense pressure on NASA. This mission cannot fail. It cannot be delayed. The world will be watching. To understand how we got here, we must go back even further, to the 1960s and 1970s, when NASA was synonymous with triumph. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon. America had won the space race against the Soviet Union. NASA was untouchable. Its engineers were heroes, and the sky was no longer the limit. But in the mid-1970s, something changed. The Vietnam War had devastated the economy. The American public was tired of government spending. NASA's budget was drastically cut. Dreams of lunar bases and trips to Mars evaporated. The solution was a space shuttle, a reusable craft that, according to initial promises, would make space travel routine, affordable, and frequent. The first shuttle, Columbia, launched on April 12, 1981. It was a resounding success. By 1986, NASA had completed 24 successful shuttle missions. The agency had promised 24 missions that same year. It's an ambitious, almost impossible schedule. But NASA needs to demonstrate that the program is viable, that the shuttles can fly as frequently as commercial airliners. The pressure is immense. Every delay is a public embarrassment. Every success is a validation. And in this context of constant pressure, voices of caution begin to be seen as obstacles. At Morton Thiokol, an aerospace company in Utah, a group of engineers has been concerned for years with a specific problem: O-rings. The shuttle solid rocket boosters, two giant cylinders that attach to the sides of the external tank, are made of segments held together by rubber-sealed joints called O-rings. These rings must keep the hot combustion gases contained within the rocket. If they fail, the gases can escape. And here's the problem. These rings are temperature sensitive. When it's cold, the rubber hardens, loses flexibility, and doesn't seal properly. Roger Boysley, a 50-year engineer at Morton Thiokol, has documented this problem meticulously. He has written memos, presented data, and warned again and again on previous flights, especially the one in January 1985, when the takeoff temperature was 12 degrees Celsius. Evidence of erosion was found on the O-rings. Hot gases had managed to partially break through. Boysley and other engineers know they're sitting on a ticking time bomb, but their warnings are downplayed. Managers argue that there has never been a catastrophic failure, that the system has redundancies, that missions can't continue to be delayed due to theoretical concerns. In July 1985, Boysley wrote an internal memo that would prove prophetic. It is my honest and professional opinion that if immediate action is not taken, then we are expecting a large-scale disaster. The result would be a loss of the vehicle and crew. The document is archived. The missions continue. January 1986. An unusual Arctic air mass descends on Florida. Temperatures drop to record levels. Icicles hang from the launch structures at Cape Canaveral. The water in the pipes freezes. The STS-51 L mission was originally scheduled for January 22nd, but delay after delay has postponed it. First, minor technical problems. Then, bad weather. Then, another delayed mission that blocked the pad. By January 27th, frustration at NASA has reached its peak. Takeoff is scheduled for the morning of the 28th. But on the evening of the 27th, temperatures drop dramatically. Forecasts indicate that on the morning of launch, the temperature will be -2 degrees Celsius, the coldest ever recorded for a shuttle takeoff. At Morton Thiokol's offices in Utah, engineers receive weather reports. Panic sets in. Boysley and others know what this means. The O-rings will be dangerously cold and stiff. That same night of January 27th, at 8:45 p.m. Eastern Time, an emergency teleconference begins between Morton Thiokol, the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, and the Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama. Thiokol engineers present their data. They show graphs of temperature versus O-ring damage from previous flights. Their conclusion is clear and straightforward. Do not launch if the temperature is below 12 degrees Celsius. The predicted temperature is -2 degrees Celsius. His recommendation: don't throw. On the other end of the line, NASA managers are incredulous. When do you want to launch, next April? One asks sarcastically. My God, Thiokol, when do you want to launch, next summer? Another exclaims. The pressure is palpable even through the phone lines. This is the most visible launch of the year. President Reagan plans to mention the mission in his State of the Union address that same evening. The media is ready. Thousands of spectators will arrive at dawn. Thiokol managers call a break. They turn off their phones to discuss internally. And here something extraordinary and terrible happens. The engineers are excluded from the final decision. Boysley and his colleagues desperately present their arguments, but the company's vice presidents are under financial pressure. Thiokol has multi-million-dollar contracts with NASA that could be jeopardized. One of the executives asks a question that will change everything. We have to make a management decision, not an engineering one, a management one. After 30 minutes, the call is reconnected. Thiokol's vice president reports that, after reconsidering, they recommend proceeding with the launch. The engineers are horrified. Boysley feels as if he's made a mistake. But the decision has been made. The mission will continue. The morning of January 28, 1986, dawned clear but brutally cold. Icicles up to 30 centimeters long hung from the launch pad. The inspection team reported ice on virtually every surface. They had never seen anything like it. There's another emergency meeting. The ice team expresses its concerns. What if the icicles break off during launch and damage the shuttle's delicate thermal tiles? What if the ice disrupts the systems? But concerns about the O-rings aren't mentioned at this meeting. Last night's decision has been kept in a small circle. Launch directors aren't fully informed about the temperature debate. The decision is made to delay the launch by an hour to allow time for the ice to melt in the morning sun. Minor adjustments. Cosmetic measures. At 11:38 a.m. Eastern Time, the countdown clock hits 0. The Challenger rises. The main engines roar. The solid rocket boosters ignite. The shuttle lifts off the pad in clouds of steam and fire. In the control room, everyone breathes a sigh of relief. The launch seems perfect. In the stands, the astronauts' families watch proudly. Krista McAuliffe's parents smile. Her students, gathered at school in New Hampshire, applaud in front of the television. But on the telemetry monitors, which few are watching at the moment, something is already wrong. At 558 milliseconds after ignition, a small puff of black smoke escapes from the right solid rocket booster near the lower rear seal. That's 8 puffs of smoke, evidence that the O-ring has failed. 59 seconds into the flight, the Challenger faces maximum aerodynamic pressure, what engineers call max Q. This is the moment of greatest structural stress. The winds in the upper atmosphere are stronger than normal for that day. At 64 seconds, a small flame appears on the side of the right booster rocket. Hot gases are escaping. At 72 seconds, the flame has become a blowtorch that reaches the external tank of liquid hydrogen. At 73 seconds, the tank fails structurally. The liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen mix and ignite. The resulting explosion isn't really an explosion. It's a massive deflagration. The shuttle disintegrates due to aerodynamic forces. Commander Scobie's last recorded communication is, "Roger. Go at throttle up. Full power ahead." They didn't know what was happening below them. The world watches as the Challenger breaks into pieces. The still-lit booster rockets fly, uncontrolled in opposite directions, before being destroyed by the flight safety officer. Debris falls into the Atlantic Ocean. In the control room, the silence is absolute. The flight controllers stare at each other in disbelief. In the stands, horror replaces joy. And in an office in Utah, Roger boisterously watches on television and knows exactly what went wrong. His worst fears have come true. NASA has just lost not just 7 lives. It has lost its invincibility, its mystique, its promise that space can be routine and safe. And the questions begin. How did this happen? Who is responsible? What did they know? And when did they know it? Episode 2, The Ocean Quest. The echoes of the explosion still resonate in the air above Cape Canaveral. Fragments of the Challenger crash into the Atlantic Ocean like a deadly rain. Pieces of twisted metal, electronic components, and thermal tiles. Everything scattered over an area of more than 160 square kilometers of ocean. In the control room, Flight Director Jay Green utters the words no one wants to hear. Shut down all consoles. Keep data secure. He doesn't say crash. He doesn't say explosion. He simply orders the evidence to be preserved because everyone knows an investigation is coming. On television screens across the country, replays of the Challenger's destruction play over and over again. CNN interrupts its regular programming. ABC, NBC, and CBS do the same. The world stops. President Ronald Reagan, who was scheduled to deliver his State of the Union address that evening, cancels the event. Instead, that afternoon from the Oval Office, he delivers an address to the nation. His voice is solemn. Today is a day of mourning and remembrance. Nancy and I are deeply saddened by the tragedy of the Challenger shuttle. We know that we share this grief with all the people of our country. This is truly a national loss. But mourning must wait. There's a more urgent task, finding the remains. And more importantly, finding the astronauts. What the public doesn't yet know is a devastating fact. The crew cabin survived the initial explosion intact. The 7 astronauts didn't die in the blast. The cabin, with them inside, plummeted from an altitude of 18 kilometers to the ocean, a descent lasting 2 minutes and 45 seconds. Investigators will later discover evidence that some, perhaps 3, of the astronauts activated their emergency oxygen systems after the vehicle broke up, a procedure that requires awareness and deliberate action. This means that at least some of them were conscious during the crash. No one survives impacting the water from that height. The cabin hit the surface of the Atlantic at over 330 kilometers per hour. The force of impact was approximately 200 times Earth's gravity. Death was instantaneous at that moment, but this detail won't be revealed to the public for months. For now, the search is focused on recovering any remains of the shuttle to understand what went wrong. Hours after the disaster, the largest recovery operation in NASA history begins. U.S. Navy, Coast Guard, and private vessels converge on the impact area off the coast of Cape Canaveral. The ocean in that area reaches depths of 400 meters in some places. Visibility underwater is practically zero. The currents are treacherous. But the mission is clear: recover every piece possible. Divers descend repeatedly. Underwater robots sweep the ocean floor. Radars map submerged objects. It's exhausting, dangerous, and emotionally devastating work. Divers are trained for rescue missions, not to recover the human remains of their heroes. On March 6th, more than a month after the disaster, Navy divers discovered the crew cabin at a depth of 28 meters. Inside, they found the remains of all 7 astronauts. Positive identification requires dental records and forensic analysis. The families were notified privately. It was then that the terrible truth about the conscious fall was confirmed. But NASA officials decided not to make this full information public. They argued they would add unnecessary suffering to the families. The official narrative maintains that death occurred instantly upon disintegration. It's a white lie, but a lie nonetheless. 5 days after the disaster, President Reagan established the Presidential Commission on the Space Shuttle Challenger accident. The commission will be composed of 13 members and chaired by William P. Rogers, former Secretary of State. Among the members are impressive names: Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon; Sally Ride, the first American woman in space; test pilot Chuck Yeager. But the member who will prove most crucial is Richard Feynman, the 67-year-old Nobel Prize-winning physicist known for his independent thinking and rejection of nonsense. The commission has 4 months to investigate and submit a report. This is an extraordinarily short time frame for an investigation of this magnitude, but public pressure demands swift responses. The hearings begin in February. They are nationally televised. NASA presents its preliminary findings, but something doesn't add up. The testimony is cautious, technical, designed to avoid assigning premature blame. But Feynman isn't satisfied with the official answers. He begins his own parallel investigation, speaking directly with low-level engineers, technicians, people who really know the systems. On February 11, 1986, during a public hearing of the commission, a moment occurred that would become legendary in the history of scientific research. Richard Feynman has in his possession a simple O-ring, a sample of the type used on Challenger booster rockets. He also has a glass of ice water, which he requested from an assistant. As a NASA official gives technical testimony about the rocket's joints, Feynman interrupts. With the simplicity that characterizes a true genius, he takes the O-ring with tweezers, dips it into the ice water, and waits a few seconds. Then he takes it out and presses it. The ring is stiff. It doesn't regain its shape. It has no flexibility. I find that when I take these materials and put them in ice water, they lose their resilience for a while. Feynman says in his distinctive New York accent. So when they're cold, they don't return to their original shape. It's an experiment any high school student could perform, but its simplicity is its power. In 30 seconds, Feynman has visually demonstrated the central problem that caused the Challenger disaster. The cameras capture the moment. The other committee members exchange glances. NASA officials blanch. The American public, watching at home, finally understands. It wasn't an unforeseeable accident. It was an understandable, preventable failure caused by cold conditions that hardened the gasket material. The question is no longer what went wrong. The question now is, who knew about this problem, and why was a launch allowed? As the investigation progresses, Morton Thiokol engineers are called to testify. Roger boisterously appears before the commission and, for the first time publicly, tells the full story of his ignored warnings. He describes the July 1985 memo. He explains the meetings where he presented data. He recounts, in a trembling voice, the teleconference on the evening of January 27th, when he recommended against launching and was ignored. "I argued fiercely that we shouldn't launch," says Boisjoli. "I showed photos of previous damage to the rings. I explained the basic physics. But I wasn't listened to." When he describes how the engineers were excluded from the final management decision, his voice cracks. "I knew at that moment we were going to lose a ship. I just knew it." The testimony is devastating, not only for what it reveals about the decision to launch, but for what it exposes about NASA's culture. An organization that once valued technical excellence above all else had become a bureaucracy where concerns of engineers could be overridden by management decisions. Other engineers also testify, confirming Boisjoli's story. They speak of a culture of normalizing deviance, where repeated problems began to be seen as acceptable because they hadn't caused a disaster yet. For Roger Boisjoli, telling the truth comes at a terrible cost. After his testimony, he becomes a pariah at Morton Thiokol. Colleagues avoid him in the hallways. His job is reassigned. Eventually, he suffers a nervous breakdown and must take medical leave. He had done the right thing. He had tried to save lives. But corporate culture doesn't forgive those who make the company look bad, even when they're right. Other engineers face similar fates. Some are transferred to less important positions. Others decide to resign. The lesson is clear and terrifying. Reporting safety issues can destroy your career. Meanwhile, the Morton Thiokol executives and NASA managers who made the decision to launch stand their ground. Internal investigations result in recommendations, not dismissals. The injustice is palpable. Those who warn suffer. Those who ignored the warning survive. On June 6, 1986, the Rogers Commission presented its final report. The 256-page document is exhaustive in its technical analysis, but cautious in assigning individual blame. The direct cause of the accident is clear. Failure of the O-ring on the right solid rocket booster, exacerbated by unusually cold temperatures. But the root cause goes deeper. The report identifies flaws in NASA's decision-making process, deficiencies in the safety program, schedule pressures that compromise safety, and a flawed organizational structure that impeded effective communication. Richard Feynman insists on including his own personal appendix to the report. In it, he writes one of the most quoted lines in the history of risk management. For a successful technology, reality must take priority over public relations, because nature cannot be fooled. The report includes 9 major recommendations, ranging from redesigning the rocket's joints to restructuring shuttle program management and improving safety culture. But there's one thing the report can't restore: the trust of the American public. For years, Americans believed NASA was infallible, that its engineers were the best in the world, that the space program was a model of excellence. The Challenger demonstrated that even the most respected organizations can fail catastrophically when pressure, politics, and pride overrule technical judgment. The era of space innocence is over. And the question that haunts NASA as it begins its slow recovery is simple but tormenting. Will it ever be able to fly again without the ghost? Episode 3. The names behind the stars. Before they were astronauts, before they were national symbols, before their names were engraved on commemorative plaques, they were people. They had childhoods, dreams, disappointments, triumphs. They loved, they laughed, they fought to get where they were. This is a part of the story that gets lost among technical reports and engineering analyses. The complete lives of 7 extraordinary human beings who woke up one January morning not knowing it would be their last day. Francis Richard Scobie, Michael John Smith, Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Gregory Jarvis, Krista McAuliffe. Each name represents decades of experiences, decisions, and sacrifices. Each left behind devastated families, unfulfilled dreams, and legacies that were just beginning. To truly honor the Challenger, we must know not only how they died, but how they lived. Francis Richard Scobie, known as Dick, was born on May 19, 1939, in Cleveland, Elm, Washington, a small railroad town in the Cascade Mountains. His father worked for the railroad. His mother was a homemaker. There was nothing in his background to suggest a destiny among the stars. But Dick always looked up. As a boy, he built model airplanes. He dreamed of flying. When he was 16, his family moved to Auburn, Washington, where Dick attended high school and met Virginia June Kent, who would become his wife. After high school, Dick didn't have money for college. He enlisted in the Air Force as an aircraft mechanic. It was 1957. He worked on jets, maintaining them, studying every system. And in his spare time, he took night classes at the University of Arizona, earning his degree in aerospace engineering one class at a time over 7 years. In 1965, he finally achieved his dream. He was accepted into the Air Force's pilot training program. He flew more than 6,500 hours in 45 different types of aircraft. He served 2 combat tours in Vietnam, flying more than 100 missions. But flying military jets wasn't enough. In 1972, Dick applied to the Air Force's Test Pilot School. He was accepted, and there, testing the limits of new aircraft, he distinguished himself so much that NASA took notice. In January 1978, Dick Scobie was selected as an astronaut. He was 38 years old. It had taken him 2 decades to go from being an enlisted mechanic to astronaut, but he had done it through sheer determination. His first spaceflight was in April 1984 as Challenger pilot on mission STS-41C. He and his crew repaired a satellite in orbit, an impressive technical feat. When he returned, his teenage children greeted him with banners. His wife, June, wept with joy and relief. 2 years later, he was given the honor of commanding a mission, the Challenger again, the mission with the teacher on board. It would be his chance to lead, to demonstrate everything he had learned. On the morning of January 28, 1986, Dick said goodbye to June as always. A kiss, a smile. See you in a week. He was 46 years old. He left behind a wife and 2 children who would never see him grow old. Judith Arlene Resnick was born on April 5, 1949, in Akron, Ohio, the daughter of an optometrist. From a young age, Judy was exceptionally intelligent. Not just intelligent, brilliant, curious, and relentless in her pursuit of knowledge. In high school, while other girls worried about dances and dates, Judy won prizes in science and math. She graduated at the top of her class. She went to Carnegie Mellon University, where she earned a degree in electrical engineering, one of the few college fields dominated almost entirely by men in the 1960s. She didn't stop there. She earned her Ph.D. in electrical engineering from the University of Maryland in 1977. She worked for RCA designing circuits, for Xerox on optical systems. She published academic papers. She became a registered professional engineer, and then he applied to NASA. In 1978, NASA opened its doors to female astronauts for the first time. Judy was one of 6 women selected from more than 8,000 applicants. She was 29 years old. Her first flight was in August 1984, becoming the second American woman in space after Sally Ride. During that mission, she operated the shuttle's robotic arm with such precision that she impressed even the most skeptical engineers about women in space. Judy faced constant sexism. Reporters asked her if she would cry in space, if the space program should accommodate her menstrual cycle, questions they would never ask a man. She answered patiently but firmly, letting her competition speak for itself. She was a perfectionist to the point of being hard on herself. She played classical piano to relax. She ran marathons. She never married or had children, devoting all her energy to her career. When she was assigned to the STS-51L mission, she was excited. It would be her second flight, and this time one of her roles would be to deploy a crucial communications satellite, a serious technical responsibility. The night before the launch, she spoke to her father on the phone. She told him she was ready, that she trusted her crew, and that she couldn't wait to get back into space. He was 36 years old. He'd come so far, and he still had so much left to achieve. Ronald Irvin McNair was born on October 21st, 1950, in Lake City, South Carolina, a small, deeply segregated town in the Jim Crow South. His father worked as an auto repairman. His mother cleaned houses. Ron grew up in poverty and racism, but his parents had a clear message. Education is your way out. Read everything you can. Learn everything you can. No one can take away what you know. At 9 years old, Ron walked to the Lake City Public Library. It was 1959. Libraries in South Carolina were still segregated. The librarian, a white woman, told him he couldn't be there. It was for whites only. Ron refused to leave. He sat down. He said he wouldn't move until he was allowed to check out books. The librarian called the police. When they arrived, they called his mother. Pearl McNair arrived at the library, looked at her son sitting quietly, and said to the librarian, "He's going to check out those books." And he did. He was one of the first black children to borrow books from that library. Decades later, the library would be renamed in his honor. Ron graduated from high school at the top of his class. He received a scholarship to North Carolina A&T State University, a historically black college. He majored in physics. He graduated magna cum laude in 1971. Then MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He earned his Ph.D. in laser physics in 1976. From the segregated town of Lake City to MIT, it was an extraordinary journey. But Ron wasn't just a scientist. He played the saxophone, jazz, blues, soul. He held a 5th-degree black belt in karate. He competed in national tournaments. He was a Renaissance man, scientist, musician, athlete, professor. In January 1978, he was selected as an astronaut. His first flight was in February 1984. During that mission, he operated complex scientific equipment and conducted experiments in microgravity. Ron was married to Cheryl Moore. They had 2 children, Joy, 8, and Reginald, 3. The family lived in Houston. On weekends, Ron took his children to the park, played music with friends, and taught karate to at-risk youth. He planned to take his saxophone into space on the Challenger mission and record the first jazz session in orbit. He had already coordinated with Jean-Michel Jarre, the French composer, to include the piece on an album. On January 27th, he called his brother Carl. They talked about their mom, about Lake City, about how far they'd come. "The next flight is for Mom and Dad," Ron said, "for everything they sacrificed." He was 35 years old. His children would grow up without a father. His saxophone would never reach space. Ellison Shoji Onizuka was born on June 24, 1946, in Kealakekua, Hawaii, to Japanese immigrants. His grandparents had come to Hawaii to work on the coffee plantations. The family was poor but close-knit. Ellison grew up in the shadow of post-Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, when Japanese Americans faced discrimination and suspicion. But he never let that define his future. He studied aerospace engineering at the University of Colorado. He became an Air Force test pilot. In January 1978, NASA selected him as an astronaut. His first flight was in January 1985, making him the first Asian American in space. For the Japanese American community, especially those who remember the World War II internment camps, his achievement was deeply symbolic. Ellison was a devout Buddhist, the loving husband of Lorna and the father of 2 daughters. He was quiet, meticulous, and a perfectionist. His crewmates described him as the kind of person you'd trust with your life. Michael John Smith, known as Mike, was born on April 30th, 1945, in Beaufort, North Carolina. He was the only child of parents who worked in the fishing industry. Mike attended the United States Naval Academy, graduated in 1967, and became a naval pilot. He flew A-6 intruder attack aircraft from aircraft carriers. He served in Vietnam. He later became a test pilot, graduating from the Naval Test Pilot School. He flew 28 different types of aircraft, accumulating more than 4,000 flight hours. When NASA selected him as an astronaut in May 1980, Mike was 35 years old. He had waited 6 years for this moment, applying multiple times. The Challenger mission would be his first spaceflight, his dream come true. He was married to Jane and had 3 children. The night before the launch, he sent them a recorded message. "Don't worry. Everything's going to be okay. I love you." Gregory Bruce Jarvis was born on August 24, 1944, in Detroit, Michigan. Greg studied electrical engineering in Buffalo, New York State. He earned his master's degree from Northeastern University. He worked for Hughes Aircraft, designing communications satellite systems. He wasn't a career astronaut. He was a payload engineer, specifically assigned to monitor satellite communications experiments during flight. Greg had originally been scheduled for other missions, but was bumped twice due to last-minute changes. Challenger would be his third assignment. He was determined to finally get to space. He was married to Marcia, with no children. He was an avid cyclist and a lover of outdoor sports. His colleagues described him as brilliant yet humble, a true engineer who cared more about work than fame. 3 men, Ellison, Mike, Greg, different backgrounds, different paths, but all shared the same passion for exploration, the same willingness to take calculated risks for the advancement of knowledge. Sharon Krista McAuliffe was born on September 2, 1948, in Boston, Massachusetts. She was the eldest of 5 children in a middle-class Irish Catholic family. Her father was an accountant, her mother a homemaker. Krista was a normal girl. She loved reading, playing with her siblings, and daydreaming. But there was something special about her, an insatiable curiosity and a natural ability to connect with people. She attended Framingham State University, where she studied education and history. In 1966, she met Steve McAuliffe at a college dance. They fell in love. They married in 1970. They had 2 children, Scott, born in 1976, and Caroline, born in 1979. Krista taught social studies and history at Concord High School in New Hampshire. She wasn't just a teacher. She was an inspiration. Her students adored her. She made history come alive. She organized simulations, debates, and creative projects. She wanted her students to not just memorize facts, but to understand how history shaped the present. In July 1985, Krista saw an advertisement. NASA was looking for a teacher to fly into space as part of its Teacher in Space program. The concept was brilliant, sending an ordinary citizen, an educator, to demonstrate that space was for everyone. More than 11,000 teachers applied. Krista was selected from among 11 finalists. Her proposal was simple but powerful. Teach lessons from space, show what life is like there, and inspire a new generation to take an interest in science. When her selection was announced in July 1985, Krista became an instant celebrity. She appeared on television programs, gave interviews, and visited schools. But she never lost her humility. She always presented herself as an ordinary teacher doing something extraordinary. Her students in Concord were ecstatic. They planned a huge viewing party for the launch. Krista had promised to teach 2 lessons from space, The Final Frontier, about the history of American exploration, and Where I've Been, a tour of the shuttle. On the evening of January 27th, Krista spoke to her parents on the phone. Her mother was nervous. "I'll be fine, Mom," Krista said. "This is the adventure of a lifetime." Steve and the kids were in Florida to watch the launch. Scott was 9, Caroline was 6. That morning, Krista hugged them. "Take care, Dad," she joked. "See you in a week." She was 37 years old. She was more than a teacher. She was a symbol that ordinary dreams can lead to extraordinary destinations. After the disaster, these 7 names became synonymous with tragedy. Monuments were erected. Schools were named. Scholarships were established. But there's a danger of hagiography, of turning real people into untouchable saints. The truth is, they were human. They had flaws, doubts, bad days, arguments with their spouses, moments of fear. Dick Scobie was sometimes too much a perfectionist, which frustrated his team. Judy Resnick could be cold when she was focused. Ron McNair struggled with being away from his family during long training sessions. Ellison Onizuka felt the pressure of representing an entire community. Mike Smith feared he wouldn't measure up to the more experienced astronauts. Greg Jarvis sometimes felt like an outsider among real astronauts. Krista McAuliffe doubted whether she deserved to be there when there were such talented teachers who weren't selected. They were human, complex, real, and that makes them even more admirable. They chose a dangerous profession, knowing the risks. They trained hard. They said goodbye to their families each time, knowing it could be the last time. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting in spite of fear. In the days following the disaster, the families of 7 astronauts faced unimaginable grief amplified by the worldwide attention. They couldn't grieve in private. Every tear was captured on camera. June Scobie had to explain to her teenage children why their father would never return. Marcia Jarvis faced her loss alone, without children to anchor her. Lorna Onizuka had to raise 2 daughters while dealing with her own grief. Jane Smith had to be strong for 3 children who had just seen their father die on national television. But perhaps no family faced more intense scrutiny than the McAuliffes. Steve had to comfort Scott and Caroline while being devastated himself. Krista's parents, Ed and Grace Corrigan, had encouraged her dream. Now they lived with the guilt of having supported her. The cameras followed them for months. Every anniversary, every milestone, was an excuse to publicly relive their loss. Over time, these families found ways to move forward. Some became advocates for space safety. Others established educational foundations in memory of their loved ones. Some simply tried to rebuild private lives away from the spotlight. But none of them escaped completely. They are forever the Challenger family. Their losses are public property. Their loved ones, national symbols. And even though decades have passed, the pain never completely goes away. You simply learn to live with it, like a wound that heals but never completely heals. The 7 names on the monument, 7 full lives reduce the letters in marble. But if you listen carefully, you can hear their full stories of determination, of sacrifice, of love for exploration. They didn't die as symbols. They died as people, and they deserve to be remembered as such. Episode 4, The Culture of Silence. To understand how Challenger could have happened, we must understand NASA not as a monolithic institution, but as a complex web of conflicting people, pressures, cultures, and motivations. In the 1960s, Apollo-era NASA was an organization with a clear mission: to land humans on the moon before the Soviets. Everything else was secondary. Engineers had final authority. If something wasn't safe, it didn't fly, period. But by the mid-1980s, NASA had fundamentally changed. The space shuttle had been sold to politicians as a reusable system that would make access to space routine and affordable. 24 flights per year had been promised. The reality was far from the promise. The shuttle was extraordinarily complex. It had more than 2.5 million moving parts. It required months of maintenance between flights. It was expensive. Each launch cost approximately $500 million. And here was the core problem. NASA had oversold and underdelivered. There were contracts with commercial, military, and scientific customers. Every delay meant financial penalties, dissatisfied customers, and threats to future budgets. The pressure to stay on schedule became overwhelming. And in that pressure, something fundamental changed. Technical problems began to be seen not as warning signs, but as obstacles to overcome. Sociologist Diane Vaughan would spend years after the disaster studying exactly how NASA got to the point where launching with faulty O-rings seemed acceptable. She coined a term that would become fundamental in the study of organizational disasters: normalization of deviance. The concept is simple but insidious. When something goes wrong but doesn't result in a catastrophe, failure gradually becomes a new normal. Safety boundaries shift incrementally until what was once unacceptable becomes routine. With the O-rings, the chronology was as follows. In April 1981, the second shuttle flight, minor erosion was found on the O-rings after flight. Engineers documented the problem, but because the flight had been successful, the problem was classified as acceptable. In November 1981, more erosion, documented again. Again, since there was no catastrophic failure, it was accepted. Flight after flight, the erosion continued. Sometimes worse, sometimes less, but consistently present. And each time, after discussions and meetings, it was decided it was acceptable to continue flying. Engineers like Boysterly were alarmed, but their managers argued, "We've flown with this problem before and nothing bad happened. Why would this time be any different?" It's fatally flawed reasoning. It's like playing Russian roulette and, after surviving several rounds, concluding that the gun must be empty. By 1986, there were indeed 2 NASAs. There was the NASA of engineers, technicians, scientists, people who understood the systems intimately. They saw every problem as a potential risk. They wanted more testing time, more data, more analysis. For them, safety was absolute. And there was a NASA of managers, people responsible for budgets, schedules, customer relations, and politicians. They viewed problems through a different lens. What's the real risk? How much will a delay cost? What will our critics say if we don't meet our commitments? These two cultures constantly clashed. And in that conflict, organizational structure mattered, because engineers reported to managers, not the other way around. Engineers could raise concerns, but managers made the final decisions. At the Marshall Space Flight Center, where solid rocket boosters were managed, managers had developed a reputation for being aggressive, pushing to meet schedules, and viewing safety concerns as public relations issues rather than technical problems. Lawrence Malloy, manager of the solid rocket booster project at Marshall, was known for his impatience with delays. In meetings, when engineers raised concerns, he frequently asked, "When do you want me to launch, next year?" This atmosphere of intimidation wasn't explicit. No one directly ordered engineers to ignore safety issues. But the message was clear. If you raise too many concerns, you're part of the problem, not the solution. Alan McDonald was the director of the Solid Rocket Booster Project at Morton Thiokol. On the night of January 27th, he was at Cape Canaveral preparing for launch. When the cold weather teleconference began, McDonald sided with the engineers. He supported the recommendation not to launch. He fiercely argued that the cold posed an unacceptable risk. But when his superiors at Thiokol bowed to NASA pressure and changed the recommendation to proceed with launch, they asked McDonald to sign the official approval. He refused. "I'm not going to sign this," he said. "You're making a decision outside the experience database. I won't sign anything authorizing this launch under these conditions." It was a moment of extraordinary courage. In that room, McDonald knew he was risking his career, but he couldn't consciously approve something he believed was dangerous. His managers signed on in his place. The launch proceeded. After the disaster, McDonald, like Boysley, testified honestly before the Rogers Commission about everything that had happened. And like Boysley, he paid a price. He was removed from his position as project manager and reassigned to a less important job. Only after the story became public and congressional pressure was applied did Thiokol restore him to a position of responsibility. But the message had been sent. Those who tell inconvenient truths are punished. One of the most frustrating aspects of the Challenger disaster is that the information about the risks existed. It wasn't hidden in secret files. It was documented, circulated, and presented at meetings. Boysley's July 1985 memo was explicit. "If no action is taken, we expect disaster." That document was sent to multiple levels of management at Thiokol and NASA. There were presentations with graphs showing the correlation between temperature and O-ring damage. There were meetings where the problem was discussed at length. Working groups were formed to study solutions. So why has nothing changed? Part of the problem was the volume of information. NASA generated thousands of pages of technical documents every week. Problem reports, risk analyses, change requests. Senior managers couldn't read everything. They relied on subordinates to escalate only the most critical issues. But the deeper problem was the culture of risk-taking that had developed. The O-rings were officially a Criticality 1 component, a component whose failure would result in loss of vehicle and crew. There was no redundancy, no backup, but management had approved an exemption to this status based on the argument that the secondary O-ring provided redundancy. This despite engineers pointing out that under pressure and temperature conditions, both rings could fail simultaneously. It was bureaucracy absorbing risk. Words on paper that created the illusion of security where none existed. We can't talk about NASA's culture without discussing the political context in which it operated. President Ronald Reagan was a strong supporter of the space program, but his administration was also committed to reducing government spending. NASA's budget had been relatively flat for years, even as the agency was expected to dramatically increase flight frequency. It was an impossible equation, do more with less. In addition, there was specific pressure related to the Teacher in Space program. Reagan had personally announced the initiative. He planned to mention Krista McAuliffe's mission in his State of the Union address on the evening of January 28th. Was there direct pressure from the White House to launch? There's no evidence of that. But NASA was painfully aware of the expectations. A delay of the year's most visible mission would be publicly embarrassing. And then there was the military factor. The Department of Defense had invested heavily in the shuttle program to launch reconnaissance satellites. They had their own schedule of classified missions that depended on civilian missions not being delayed. All of this created an atmosphere where delaying a launch was seen not only as a technical inconvenience, but as an organizational failure with political and financial consequences. The Rogers Commission identified a fundamental problem in NASA's culture by the mid-1980s. The burden of proof had reversed. At NASA during Apollo, the default position was, we don't launch unless you can prove it's safe. Engineers had to positively demonstrate that a system would work. But at NASA's shuttle, the default position had become, launch unless you can prove it unsafe. The burden was on the engineers to definitively prove there would be a failure. This subtle but critical shift changed the entire dynamic of security discussions. Instead of asking, how do we know this will work? The question became, can you prove this will fail? It's almost impossible to prove a negative. Boisterly and his colleagues could show that the O-rings degraded in the cold. They could show worrying correlations. They could argue from principles of materials physics. But they couldn't definitively prove that the next launch specifically would fail. And in the absence of absolute proof, management chose to proceed. Richard Feynman, in his appendix to the Commission's report, wrote about this. For successful technology, reality must take priority over public relations, because nature cannot be fooled. But NASA in 1986 had lost sight of this fundamental truth. Public relations, schedules, budgets. Everything had begun to take priority over technical reality. The Challenger disaster wasn't a single bout of bad luck. It was a culmination of years of ignored warning signs, each a missed opportunity to avoid tragedy. Signal 1. In November 1981, after the shuttle's second flight, erosion of the O-rings was discovered. An engineer wrote in his report, this is a potentially serious problem. The recommendation was to continue monitoring. No flights were stopped. Signal 2. In January 1985, Flight STS-51, C took off in a temperature of 12 degrees Celsius, the coldest ever recorded. After the flight, the most severe O-ring erosion ever seen was found. There was damage to the primary ring, and evidence that hot gases had reached the secondary ring. It was a near disaster. An internal memo stated, the lack of a good secondary gasket in the event of a primary failure to seal is a serious flight safety issue. But the conclusion was acceptable for flight. Signal 3. In July 1985, Boisterly wrote his prophetic memo warning of a large-scale disaster. The document reached high levels of management. A task force was formed, but the urgency was diluted by bureaucracy. No fundamental design changes were made before the next flights. Signal 4. In October 1985, during a flight certification review, engineers presented data showing that O-rings should not be used below 12 degrees Celsius. Managers noted the concern, but did not set firm temperature limits for launches. Signal 5. In December 1985 and January 1986, 3 missions scheduled before Challenger experienced cold weather delays. Each time, there were discussions about temperatures and O-rings. Each time, the decision was made to proceed when temperatures rose sufficiently, but no one established an official written temperature limit. Each of these signals was an opportunity, a chance to say, this is not acceptable. We're stopping flights until we fundamentally resolve the problem. But at each point, the organization chose a path of least resistance. Manage the risk, accept the deviation, continue flying. Why? Because halting the program would have been devastating. It would have meant admitting that the shuttle had a fundamental design flaw. It would have delayed missions for years. It would have cost billions to redesign. It would have fueled critics of the space program. It would have threatened NASA's budget. So instead of facing that difficult reality, the organization convinced itself that the risk was manageable, that the next mission would be fine, that they could solve the problem gradually while continuing to fly. It's a mindset that appears again and again in organizational disasters. The desire to believe things will be okay because stopping has an immediate and unacceptable cost, while the potential disaster remains abstract and future. Until suddenly it isn't. Until the theory becomes a terrifying reality in a January sky. And then the true cost becomes clear. 7 lives, public trust destroyed, the space program halted for years, billions in emergency redesigns, and a permanent stain on the reputation of one of the world's most respected organizations. The signs were there. They were documented. They were presented. They were discussed. But they weren't heeded. And that's perhaps the most important lesson from Challenger. In complex organizations managing dangerous technologies, it's not enough for the right people to know about the problems. The organization must have mechanisms to ensure that information reaches decision-makers, and that those decision-makers have the culture, incentives, and courage to act even when it's difficult, costly, and uncomfortable. NASA would learn these lessons, but the price of learning was incalculably high. Episode 5, The Investigation. For weeks after the disaster, ships and divers continued to comb the Atlantic Ocean. Each recovered piece was photographed, labeled, and transported to a massive hangar at Cape Canaveral, where researchers attempted to piece together the deadly puzzle. It's like forensic archaeology. Fragments of twisted metal, electronic components, soaked in salt water, wing sections, pieces of the fuselage. Some pieces are immediately identifiable. Others are just burnt scrap. But every part tells part of the story. Engineers study burn patterns, metal deformations, and breakpoints. They're looking for answers to specific questions. What failed first? How did the failure propagate? When did the vehicle lose structural integrity? The reconstruction hangar becomes an almost sacred place. Technicians work silently, reverently, knowing they are handling the remains of a tomb. On the floor, they have traced the full-scale outline of the shuttle. Each recovered piece is placed in its approximate position. Slowly, very slowly, the image emerges, and what it shows is devastating in its clarity. As telemetry data, high-speed film, and physical remains are analyzed, investigators reconstruct the 73 seconds of flight with terrifying precision. T plus 0.678 seconds. First evidence of black smoke escaping from the rear seal of the right solid rocket booster. There are 8 distinct puffs. The smoke is particles of burnt rubber from the O-ring. The seal has been failing since ignition. T plus 2.5 seconds. The smoke stops. Investigators determined that the molten aluminum from the propellant combustion temporarily created a seal, like an emergency dam containing the leak. T plus 37 seconds. The Challenger reaches the area of maximum dynamic pressure, known as max Q. High-altitude winds buffet the vehicle. These winds are stronger than normal for that day. T plus 58.788 seconds. First evidence of visible flame on the side of the right booster rocket. The temporary aluminum seal has failed. Hot gases at over 1,600 degrees Celsius are escaping. T plus 60 seconds. The flame becomes a distinct blowtorch. It is directly striking the external liquid hydrogen tank and the structural support connecting the rocket to the tank. T plus 64.660 seconds. The telemetry camera shows a bright, continuous explosion. The torch has burned through the structural support. The booster rocket begins to rotate. T plus 72.20 seconds. Liquid hydrogen begins escaping en masse from the tank. The mixture with oxygen is explosive. T plus 73.124 seconds. The external tank fails structurally. This is an explosion in the traditional sense, but rather a deflagration, the rapid burning of mixed propellants. The fireball is visible from the ground. T plus 73.137 seconds. Last telemetry recorded from Challenger. Systems lose power. The crew cabin, which is designed to separate in emergencies but was never activated because the crew didn't have time to respond, separates intact. It begins its free fall from 18 kilometers. This entire sequence, from the first puff of smoke to total disintegration, occurs in less than a minute and a half. The crew never knew what was happening below them until it was too late. Richard Feynman isn't satisfied with simply listening to NASA presentations. He wants to understand the systems firsthand. So he does something unusual for a commission member. He goes to Cape Canaveral and the Johnson Space Center and talks with engineers, technicians, and workers on the ground. Feynman has a knack for reducing complex problems to their essential elements, and he quickly realizes that there is a massive disconnect between managers' understanding and technical reality. When you ask NASA managers about the probability of a catastrophic shuttle failure, they give you numbers like 1 in 100,000 flights. It's an absurdly optimistic figure. When you ask engineers the same question, the answers vary widely. Some say 1 in 100. Others say 1 in 200. Numbers that suggest each launch is essentially a high-risk gamble. Feynman is astonished by this gap. He writes in his notes, "What causes a disparity between management and engineers? They seem to have deluded themselves into believing they have designed a nearly perfect machine, when in fact they know they have a reasonably dangerous machine." This disparity explains a lot. If you truly believe your system is almost perfectly reliable, then warnings about specific problems seem like alarmist sentiment. But if you understand that you're operating at the edge of what's safe, then every warning is critical. As the Commission's hearings continue in February and March, the testimony becomes increasingly dramatic. Thiokol engineers finally tell their full story. Roger Boysley, Alan MacDonald, and others describe the January 27th teleconference in excruciating detail. The pressure from NASA, the capitulation of Thiokol management, the exclusion of engineers from the final decision. When Boysley describes how he argued against the launch and was ignored, his voice cracks. "I was pale," he says later, describing how he felt when his recommendation was rejected. "I knew they were taking an unacceptable risk." MacDonald's testimony is equally powerful. He describes how he refused to sign the release approval, knowing it would likely end his career. But perhaps the most shocking moment comes when the Commission members question the NASA managers who were on that teleconference. Lawrence Malloy, the rocket booster project manager at Marshall, defends himself by arguing that the data presented by Thiokol was inconclusive. "Everyone had the right not to launch," he says. No one was pressured. But when presented with the transcript of his own comments that night, "When do you want me to pitch next April?" it becomes clear that his version of events is selective at best. What emerges from these testimonies is a disturbing pattern. Each person involved in the decision seems to believe they made the right decision based on the information available to them. But collectively, as an organization, they made a fatal decision. It's a case study in how good people can make bad decisions when organizational incentives are misaligned. As the investigation delves deeper into the technical aspects, it becomes clear that the O-ring problem wasn't just about temperature. It was about a fundamentally flawed design. Solid rocket boosters were made of joined segments. Each joint between segments had 2 O-rings. The theory was that if the primary ring failed, the secondary would provide backup. But there was a critical design flaw. Under pressure, the metal gaskets deformed slightly, creating a small gap. Under normal conditions, the flexible O-rings expanded rapidly to fill that space. However, when it got cold, the rings lost flexibility. They couldn't expand fast enough. Hot gases found a way through. Worse still, the pressure that caused the primary ring to fail also caused the gasket to open further, which actually made it less likely that the secondary ring would be able to seal. Redundancy was an illusion. The engineers had pointed this out in 1977 during the initial design. They had recommended a different joint design. But for cost and schedule reasons, the simpler but more problematic design had been chosen. It was one of those engineering decisions where the risk seemed acceptable on paper, but turned as the investigation continues. Other problems with the shuttle program are coming to light that did not cause a Challenger accident, but suggest broader systemic problems. The shuttle's thermal tiles, critical for protecting it during re-entry, were frequently damaged and required extensive replacement between flights. It was a known problem, but one with no easy solution. The shuttle's main engines were operating at the absolute limits of what was technologically possible. Failures of turbopumps and other components were common. Safety margins were narrower than NASA publicly admitted. The flight's software was complex and occasionally buggy. The communication system had limited redundancies. None of these problems alone was fatal, but collectively, they painted a picture of a system that was far more fragile and less routine than NASA had promised. The space shuttle was a technological marvel, perhaps the most complex machine ever built by humans, but it was inherently dangerous, and to pretend otherwise was institutional denial. On June 6, 1986, the Rogers Commission presented its final report with 9 main recommendations. 1. Redesign the solid rocket booster joints to eliminate design deficiencies. 2. Establish an independent security office at NASA, reporting directly to the administrator, not filtered through program management. 3. Completely review the shuttle program management system to improve communication between engineers and decision-makers. 4. Develop a comprehensive problem tracking and defect resolution system. 5. Improve component criticality assessment and documentation. 6. Increase the role of astronauts in flight preparation decisions. 7. Improve NASA management training and communication. 8. Review the flight certification process to ensure it's rigorous and independent. 9. Maintain a realistic flight schedule that does not compromise safety. These are sensible recommendations, developed from a careful analysis of what went wrong. But implementing them will require a fundamental transformation of how NASA operates. And beyond the technical recommendations, the report does something crucial. It validates the voices of the engineers who were ignored. It publicly establishes that Boysterly, McDonald, and others were right, that their warnings were legitimate, that they should have been heeded. It's a vindication that comes too late for the 7 astronauts. But at least it sets the historical record straight. Despite the thoroughness of the investigation, one question remains unanswered. Could the Challenger disaster have been avoided? The obvious answer is yes. If the launch had been postponed due to cold temperatures, as engineers recommended, the 7 astronauts would likely have flown successfully a few days later when temperatures rose. But the deeper question is, given the state of O-ring design, given NASA's organizational culture, given the schedule and political pressures, was it inevitable that a disaster like this would eventually occur? If it hadn't been Challenger on January 28, 1986, would it have been another mission on another day? Had they created a system so complex, operating on such tight margins, under such pressure, that failure was only a matter of time? Richard Feynman thought so. In his personal appendix to the report, he wrote that NASA's estimate of the shuttle's reliability was dangerously out of touch with reality. If shuttle flights continue at the rate of 60 per year for 30 years, he calculated, we would expect roughly 60 major accidents. It was a grim prediction, and time would prove him right. In February 2003, the shuttle Columbia disintegrated during re-entry, killing 7 more astronauts. The systemic problems had not been fully resolved. The Challenger wasn't simply an isolated accident caused by a cold morning. It was the inevitable result of a system designed with inherent flaws, operated by an organization under impossible pressures, in a context where saying no was professionally dangerous. And that realization is perhaps more disturbing than any specific technical failure, because it suggests that despite our intelligence, our technology, our best intentions, we can still create systems that lead us inexorably toward disaster. The research provided answers, but the answers reveal deeper questions about how complex organizations work, how we make decisions under uncertainty, and how we balance ambition with certainty. Questions that remain relevant today, far beyond the context of the space program. Episode 6, Rebuilding the Impossible. In the days immediately following the Challenger disaster, something unprecedented in the history of the American space program happened. Everything stopped. There's no countdown at Cape Canaveral, no astronaut training in Houston, no engine testing at Stennis. The constant roar of space activity that has defined NASA for 25 years has fallen silent. In offices and laboratories across the country, thousands of NASA employees arrive at work unsure of what to do. Their schedules were planned around missions that will no longer occur. Their project depended on launches that have been indefinitely canceled. There's a sense of collective grief mixed with uncertainty about the future. Will the shuttle ever fly again? Will the space program survive? Will everything they've worked for be worth it? NASA Administrator James Beggs, who was on administrative leave for unrelated reasons at the time of the disaster, officially resigns. His interim replacement, William Graham, faces an impossible task, keeping the agency running while undergoing the most intense investigation in its history. Contracts with commercial customers are on hold. The military is beginning to look for alternative ways to launch its satellites. Scientists with experiments scheduled for flight face years of delays. NASA's budget, always vulnerable in Congress, faces threats of massive cuts. It's the lowest point in the agency's history. And the question on everyone's mind is, can NASA recover from this? In August 1986, 2 months after the Rogers Commission report, NASA announced a comprehensive plan to redesign the joints of solid rocket boosters. The redesign isn't a minor adjustment. It's a fundamental reconstruction of the seal system. Engineers eliminated the original flawed design and created a new one with multiple safety features. The new gasket includes a third O-ring, increasing redundancy. A catch system is added to prevent the gasket from opening under pressure, solving the fundamental problem that caused the original design to fail. Heaters are installed in the gaskets to ensure the O-rings remain above critical temperatures even in cold weather. But the redesign is just the beginning. Each joint must be exhaustively tested. Massive testing facilities are built where engineers subject the joints to extreme pressures, temperatures ranging from well below zero to scorching heat, and vibrations that simulate the stress of launch. Morton Thiokol, whose reputation has been shattered by the disaster, is desperate for redemption. They're investing more than $400 million in redesign and testing. They're hiring additional engineers. They're implementing more rigorous quality control systems. The process takes more than 2 years. 2 years without launches. 2 years of meticulous testing. 2 years of anxiety over whether the new design will work. But NASA knows that fixing a technical component isn't enough. The Rogers Commission was clear. The problem wasn't just faulty hardware. It was a flawed organizational culture. In June 1986, James Fletcher, who had served as NASA administrator in the 1970s, returned to lead the agency once again. His mandate was clear, to rebuild not just rockets, but NASA itself. Fletcher establishes the Office of Safety, Reliability, Maintainability, and Quality Assurance. It's a completely independent division that reports directly to the administrator, not filtered through program managers. Its job, to be the constant voice of caution, the group that can say no without fear of professional retribution. The flight readiness review process has been completely overhauled. Now, before each launch, engineers at all levels have direct access to decision makers. Safety concerns can no longer be filtered out or minimized by middle management. A formal problem tracking system is established. Every anomaly, no matter how small, must be documented, analyzed, and resolved before the next flight. The normalization of deviation will be actively combated. Astronauts are given a larger role in safety decisions. The astronaut-led Crew Safety Office is formed, which has the authority to halt a launch if concerns are identified. These are fundamental changes. But changing an organizational culture is infinitely more difficult than redesigning hardware. It requires thousands of people to change how they think, how they communicate, and what they prioritize. And it requires leadership that is committed to safety even when it is inconvenient, costly, and slow. While NASA rebuilds, there's one group of people in a particular limbo: astronauts. When the Challenger exploded, there were approximately 70 active astronauts in the NASA Astronaut Corps. Many had been training for specific missions that are now indefinitely canceled. Some had flown before. Others, like Michael Smith, had been waiting years for their first flight. Now everyone waits again, not knowing when the shuttle will fly again, not knowing if any of them will ever reach space. For some, the wait is too much. Several astronauts resigned during this period, leaving NASA for careers in the private sector or the military. It's not that they've lost their courage. It's that they can't bear the uncertainty. But most stay. They continue training. They practice in simulators. They study systems. They participate in design reviews. They keep their skills sharp for the day they can fly again. Among them is Frederick Hawk, a veteran of 2 previous space flights. In September 1988, he will be named commander of the first mission since Challenger STS-26. It is a tremendous honor and an overwhelming responsibility. We're not replacing Challenger, Hawk would later say. No one can replace those 7. But we are honoring their memory by showing that their sacrifice was not in vain, that we learned, that we improved, that the space program continues. It's an immense pressure. The world will be watching. Any failure, no matter how small, will be magnified. Success is the only acceptable option. As NASA works to rebuild its technical and cultural heritage, it faces political battles in Washington. The shuttle program had been sold as self-sustaining, generating revenue from commercial customers that would offset operating costs. But that promise now seems absurd. Commercial customers are looking for alternatives. Disposable rockets developed by private companies are capturing the market. Furthermore, the Department of Defense, which had planned to use the shuttle for most of its classified launches, is now reconsidering. Following Challenger, the Pentagon is ordering the development of new expendable rockets to ensure independent access to space. In Congress, there are calls to cancel the shuttle program altogether. Why risk more lives with a system that has proven so dangerous? Wouldn't it be safer and cheaper to use traditional expendable rockets? NASA counters that the shuttle is unique in its ability to carry large payloads, deploy and recover satellites, and enable long-duration crewed experiments. Canceling it would mean abandoning capabilities that cannot be replicated by other systems. In 1987, Congress held hearings on the future of the space program. The testimony was impassioned on both sides. Some argued that America should continue to lead in space exploration, regardless of the risks. Others argued that the era of human spaceflight was over, that robots could do the job more safely and economically. In the end, Congress decides to continue the shuttle program, but with significant changes. NASA must accept a more conservative flight schedule. No more promises of 24 missions per year. 8 to 10 missions per year is the new goal, an acknowledgement that the shuttle will never be routine. Furthermore, NASA must prioritize crew safety over all other objectives. If that means delays, so be it. If it means additional costs, so be it. It's a victory, but it comes with humility. NASA has learned that it can't promise the impossible. That space is inherently dangerous. That trust, once lost, is slowly regained. While technical and political reconstruction continues, there's another crucial task: honoring the fallen. Throughout the United States, Challenger memorials are erected. Schools are renamed. Parks are dedicated. Scholarships are established. Each of the 7 astronauts is honored individually in their home communities. In Concord, New Hampshire, Krista McAuliffe's hometown, the Krista McAuliffe Center is established. Its mission: to continue the work she began, inspiring students about space and science. Thousands of students visit each year, learning about her life and legacy. A memorial to the Challenger crew is dedicated to Arlington National Cemetery, near Washington, D.C. It's a place of reflection where families and admirers can come and remember. At the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, the visitor complex opens a permanent memorial. It includes carefully preserved artifacts recovered from the Challenger. There is also a wall with the names of all the American astronauts who have died in the line of duty. The 3 from Apollo 1 in 1967, the 7 from Challenger, and finally, the 7 from Columbia in 2003. These memorials serve a dual purpose. They honor those who died, but they also serve as permanent reminders of the cost of failure, of why safety must always be the highest priority. For the astronauts' families, these memorials are ambiguous. They are beautiful, meaningful, well-intentioned. But no statue, no name building, no scholarship can fill the void of an absent husband, a father who won't see his children grow up, a daughter who never returned home. June Scobie, Dick's widow, becomes an advocate for space education. Steve McAuliffe, Krista's widower, eventually remarries and builds a private life away from the spotlight. Cheryl McNair raises her 2 children alone, ensuring they never forget the extraordinary father they had. Every family finds its own way to move on, but no one forgets. The pain may lessen with time, but it never completely disappears. Finally, after 2 years, 8 months, and 26 days, the moment everyone has waited for and feared arrives: the return to flight. It's September 29, 1988. The shuttle Discovery is on Launch Pad 39B at Cape Canaveral, the same complex for which the Challenger launched toward its fateful destination. The STS-26 crew is 5, Commander Frederick Hawk, pilot Richard Covey, and 3 mission specialists. They have trained intensively for months. They have participated in every design review. They are familiar with every change made to the system. But knowing the technical changes doesn't eliminate the fear. They all knew the Challenger crew. They all attended the funerals. They all understand viscerally that they're boarding a machine that killed their friends. The night before the launch, Hawk speaks with his wife. "I believe in the system," he tells her. "I think we've done everything humanly possible to make it safe. But if something goes wrong, I want you to know that I died doing what I love." It's a conversation no spouse wants to have, but it's an honest one. And in its honesty, there's dignity. On the morning of launch, the atmosphere at Cape Canaveral is tense in a way it hasn't been since the early days of the space program. Every check is triple-checked. Every anomaly, no matter how minor, is exhaustively analyzed. The weather is perfect. The systems are green. But there's a last-minute pause when engineers notice an unusual sensor reading. It's probably nothing, but after Challenger, probably nothing isn't enough. The countdown stops. Engineers investigate. It takes 45 minutes to determine that the sensor is malfunctioning, but the underlying system is fine. The reading can be ignored. Finally, at 11:37 a.m. Eastern Time, the Discovery powers up. Discovery lifts off from the pad. The engines roar. The solid rocket boosters, with their redesigned and tested joints, push the shuttle skyward. In the control room, all eyes are on the clocks. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. Across the country, millions are watching on television. Schools are stopping classes to watch. Offices are installing televisions. Street traffic is slowing down as people stop to watch. 50 seconds, 60 seconds. Max Q, the moment of maximum aerodynamic pressure. The moment when the Challenger began its catastrophic failure. The Discovery passes through Max Q without any problems. 70 seconds. 73 seconds. The exact moment the Challenger disintegrated. The Discovery continues to climb. In the control room, no one breathes. In the stands at Cape Canaveral, the astronauts' families hold hands. In homes across America, people who don't normally follow the space program are glued to their screens. 2 minutes. The solid rocket boosters separate cleanly. The most dangerous part of the ascent is over. 5 minutes. 7 minutes. 8 minutes and 30 seconds. Main engines cut off. Discovery is in orbit. In the control room, applause erupts. It's not the casual celebration of a routine mission. It's applause of pure relief, of joy, of pride, of redemption. On the screen, Hawk broadcasts from the cockpit. "Discovery, you're now in orbit." Folks, it's been a great day for America, and it's great to be back in space. Tears flow freely in the control room, in the stands, in homes across the country. NASA is back. The space program has survived. The ghosts of Challenger, if not completely exorcised, have at least been honored with a perfect flight. When Discovery successfully lands 4 days later at Edwards Air Force Base in California, it marks the official close of one of the darkest chapters in the history of space exploration. NASA flew. It succeeded. It learned. But he will never, ever forget the price of those lessons. Episode 7, The Legacy. It's January 2006. Exactly 20 years have passed since the Challenger disaster. Across the United States, commemorative ceremonies mark the anniversary. At the Kennedy Space Center, aging NASA veterans gather at the Challenger Memorial. Some were in the control room that day. Others worked on the recovery. All bear the emotional scars of what they witnessed. June Scobie Rogers, who remarried years after losing Dick, speaks at the ceremony. She is 70 now, her hair gray, but her voice is strong. 20 years, she says, 2 decades without my husband, without seeing my children have their own children with their grandfather present. Time heals, they say, but some wounds you just learn to live with. Scott McAuliffe is 29 now, the same age as mother, Krista, was when she began her astronaut training. He's a judge. His sister, Caroline, is a lawyer. Both have successful lives, families of their own, but both speak of a void that can never be filled. "I don't remember her voice," Scott admits in an interview. "I have to watch videos to hear it. And every time I do, it's like losing her again." Roger Boisley, The engineer who warned and was ignored is now 69 years old. After the disaster, he suffered a deep depression. He was treated like a pariah at Morton Thiokol until he finally resigned in 1988. He spent years unable to talk about the Challenger without breaking down, but he eventually found a purpose. He became a lecturer and consultant on engineering ethics. He travels to universities, teaching future engineers about professional responsibility, about the cost of staying silent when you know something is wrong. If my story can prevent one young engineer from making the same mistake we did, he says, if it can save just one life, then maybe, just maybe, I can find some peace. After Challenger, NASA implemented profound changes. Safety culture improved dramatically. Launches became more conservative. Engineers' voices were empowered. For nearly 2 decades, the shuttle flew successfully. There were occasional technical problems, but they were handled appropriately. Launches were delayed when necessary. Schedule pressure never again outweighed safety concerns. NASA built the International Space Station, mission after mission. It deployed the Hubble Space Telescope and then repaired it in orbit. It conducted dozens of important scientific experiments. The shuttle became what was always meant to be, not routine but reliable. But institutions have short memories. As the years passed, new managers who hadn't lived through the Challenger crisis rose to leadership positions. Constant oversight began to relax. Budgets tightened again. Timelines became more ambitious. And then, on February 1st, 2003, 17 years after Challenger, the unthinkable happened again. The Space Shuttle Columbia, returning from a 16-day mission, disintegrated during re-entry over Texas. All 7 astronauts on board died. Rick Husband, William McCool, Michael Anderson, Kalpana Chawla, David Brown, Laurel Clark, and Elon Ramon. The cause was different. A piece of insulating foam had broken off the external tank during launch and struck the leading edge of the Columbia's wing, creating a hole. During re-entry, hot gases entered through this hole and destroyed the wing from within. But when the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, led by Admiral Harold Gehman, issued its report, it found something terrifying. The same cultural problems that caused the Challenger accident had returned. Normalization of deviation. Foam shedding had occurred in previous launches and had been accepted as normal. Engineers ignored. During Columbia mission, engineers requested images of the wing to assess the damage. Managers denied the request. Schedule pressure. NASA was under pressure to complete construction of the International Space Station within budget and on schedule. The lessons of the Challenger, paid for with 7 lives, had been forgotten, and the price was another 7 lives. After Columbia, the shuttle program flew for 8 more years, completing 22 additional missions, all dedicated to completing the International Space Station. But the decision had already been made. The shuttle would be retired. It was too complex, too expensive, too dangerous. 3 decades after its first flight, it was time to retire it. On July 8, 2011, the Space Shuttle Atlantis launched on mission STS-135, the final flight of the program. Commander Christopher Ferguson delivered a farewell message. The shuttle has cleared the tower. After 135 missions, 3 decades of service, the Space Shuttle program came to an end. 2 shuttles, Challenger and Columbia, had been destroyed. The remaining 3, Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour, were sent to museums. Thousands of space program workers lost their jobs. For many NASA veterans, it was a bittersweet end. The shuttle had been an engineering marvel, but it had also been deeply flawed. It had enabled incredible achievements, but it had cost 14 lives. We loved the shuttle, says a retired engineer, but it also broke our hearts. Twice. With the retirement of the shuttle, American space exploration entered a new era. NASA, without its own manned launch capability, relied on the Russians to carry astronauts to the International Space Station. It was a humiliating position for the agency that had put men on the moon. But simultaneously, something new was emerging: the commercialization of space. Private companies like SpaceX, founded by Elon Musk and Blue Origin, founded by Jeff Bezos, began developing their own launch vehicles. SpaceX, in particular, revolutionized access to space with reusable rockets that can land vertically after launch, dramatically reducing costs. In May 2020, SpaceX became the first private company to launch astronauts to the International Space Station. For many, this represents a delayed fulfillment of the shuttle's original promise, to make space accessible and affordable. But the road to that promise was paved with tragedy. The lessons learned from Challenger have directly influenced how these new space companies design their systems. SpaceX, for example, incorporated robust crew escape systems that can be activated at any stage of flight, something the shuttle never had. Rockets are thoroughly tested before carrying humans. We study every space disaster meticulously, says a SpaceX engineer. Challenger, Columbia, Apollo 1, Soyuz 1. We learn from their mistakes because we can't afford to repeat them. Boyce Spirit lives on in that philosophy. That warning about problems isn't being alarmist, it's being professional. As the decades pass, the names of the Challenger crew remain present in unexpected ways. There are craters on the moon named after each of the 7 astronauts. In deep space, 7 asteroids bear their names, orbiting the sun forever. In schools across the United States, children who weren't even born when the disaster struck are learning about Krista McAuliffe, the teacher who dreamed of teaching from space. Her legacy inspired countless young people, especially girls, to pursue careers in science and technology. The Ronald E. McNair Center in his hometown of Lake City, South Carolina, offers educational programs for underprivileged students. Scholarships in his name help minority students attend college. His story of overcoming racism and poverty to become an astronaut and physicist continues to inspire. Ellison Onizuka's son also became an astronaut, following in his father's footsteps. When he flew into space, he carried a photo of his father, closing a poignant circle. These aren't just names on plaques. They're living reminders of real people who had dreams, families, passions, who took risks for the advancement of human knowledge, who paid the ultimate price. After all the research, all the reforms, all the memorials, one question remains. Was it worth it? It's a question the families of the 14 astronauts who died in shuttle disasters have asked themselves countless times. Was the space program worth losing husbands, fathers, and sons? There's no simple answer. For some family members, the answer is an unequivocal yes. Their loved ones died doing what they loved, pursuing dreams they valued more than security. That has meaning. Dick wouldn't regret it, says June Scotty Rogers. He knew the risks. He accepted them. And if he could talk to me today, he'd say he'd do it again. That's the kind of man he was. For others, it's more complicated. The pain of loss never completely goes away. And it's hard not to wonder, what would have been different if they had lived? What more could they have achieved? What grandchildren did they never get to meet? And then there's a bigger question about the space program itself. Do the achievements justify the cost in human lives? Proponents argue that exploration is fundamental to humanity. Understanding our universe, expanding our boundaries, and inspiring new generations of scientists and engineers are goals that justify risks. Critics argue that robots can do most of what humans do in space, more cheaply and without risking their lives. We should solve problems on Earth before spending billions on space. There's no universally correct answer. It's a question of values, of priorities, of how we balance exploration with prudence. As the years turn into decades, there's a group of people dedicated to ensuring the Challenger is never forgotten. The educators, historians, and survivors who keep the story alive. At the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex, tour guides tell the story of the Challenger to millions of visitors each year. At universities, engineering professors use the case as teaching material in ethics classes. Roger Boysterly, until his death in 2012 at the age of 73, traveled tirelessly, giving lectures. Engineers have a responsibility, he insisted, to speak out when they know something is unsafe, regardless of the consequences for their careers. Alan MacDonald, who refused to sign the launch approval, wrote a detailed book about the experience, Truth, Lies, and O-Rings. Until his death in 2021, he was a vocal advocate of technical integrity over corporate politics. These guardians of memory understand something crucial. History that is not remembered is doomed to repeat itself, and the lessons of the Challenger are too important, too costly to be forgotten. It's January 2025, 39 years since the Challenger disaster. Most people alive today have no personal memories of the event. For them, it's history, like Apollo 13 or the Sputnik Challenge. But at Cape Canaveral in Houston, in the hometowns of the 7 astronauts, there are small, private ceremonies. Families gather. NASA veterans share memories. Flowers are placed at memorials. Scott and Caroline McAuliffe, now in their 40s, bring their own children. This was their grandmother. They say, showing photos of Krista with her bright smile, she wanted to teach everyone about space. And somehow, through her death, she did. Dick Scobie's grandchildren, who never knew their grandfather, hear stories about the mechanic who became an astronaut. Ron McNair's descendants learn about the boy who refused to leave a segregated library. And in all these stories, there's a common thread. These weren't mythical superheroes. They were real people with flaws and doubts, who chose to do something extraordinary despite the risks. Space exploration continues. NASA plans to return to the moon and eventually go to Mars. Private companies are building commercial space stations. Space tourism, a dream in the days of Challenger, is now a reality for those who can afford it. But every new mission, every new launch, carries with it the weight of lessons learned. Engineers designing new spacecraft study the Challenger and Columbia. Managers making launch decisions know the stories of how schedule pressure can lead to tragedy. We can never forget, says a current NASA director at a memorial ceremony. Every time we launch, we carry with us the memory of the 14 we lost. They remind us that space exploration is not routine, never will be, and we shouldn't pretend otherwise. The Challenger is not just a historical tragedy. It's a living lesson about organizations, decision-making, professional ethics, and the human cost of failure. It's a reminder that even the most respected institutions can fail catastrophically when the culture becomes dysfunctional. And perhaps most importantly, it is a testament to human courage. 73 seconds of flight that ended in disaster, but also decades of preparation, training, dreams, and hopes. 7 lives that, though ended too soon, were lived with purpose and passion. The names remain: Scobie, Smith, Resnick, McNair, Onizuka, Jarvis, McAuliffe, not just as victims, but as pioneers who reminded us that reaching for the stars will always come a price, and that price must be respected, honored, and learned. The night sky still calls to us, and when we look up at those distant stars, we can remember those who gave everything to bring humanity one step closer to them. Episode 8, Looking Forward. It's 2025. At Cape Canaveral, now renamed Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, rockets are launching regularly. But these aren't the shuttles of the 1980s. They're SpaceX's Falcon 9 rockets, United Launch Alliance's Atlas V rockets, and new vehicles from companies that didn't even exist when the Challenger exploded. The space industry has been completely transformed. What was for decades the exclusive domain of governments is now a vibrant market of private competition. And in this transformation, the lessons of Challenger resonate in unexpected ways. When SpaceX designed its Crew Dragon capsule to transport astronauts, they incorporated an escape system that could be activated at any stage of flight, from the pad to orbit. This is something the shuttle never had, a design flaw that meant that during critical moments of launch, like those fatal 73 seconds, there was no escape route. Challenger taught us that you can't assume nothing will go wrong, says a SpaceX design engineer. You have to plan for the worst-case scenario and make sure your crew can survive even if everything fails. This shift in philosophy extends beyond hardware design. Space startups have adopted cultures that, at least in theory, prioritize safety over schedule. They have fewer layers of bureaucracy and more direct communication between engineers and decision-makers. But they also face pressures that NASA in the 1980s didn't have. Pressure from investors, competitive market pressure, pressure to innovate quickly. And with those pressures comes the risk that old lessons will be forgotten again. In an office in Washington, D.C., a 78-year-old NASA veteran reviews proposals for new commercial space vehicles. His job is to advise the FAA on the safety of these new craft. He was in the control room the day the Challenger exploded. He was 39 years old at the time, a young engineer full of ambition and confidence. That day changed something fundamental in him. "I see the same signs sometimes," he says, looking at technical documents. The pressure to meet schedules. The concerns of engineers being downplayed because there's no absolute proof of a problem. The gradual normalization of small deviations from standards. His job now is to be the voice of warning, the one who says, "Wait, slow down, think about this again." It's not always popular. Companies complain that it's delaying progress. But he saw what happens when warnings are ignored. "I can't bring them back," he says, referring to the Challenger 7. "But I can honor their memory by making sure their death meant something, that lessons were truly learned." There's a whole generation of space professionals like him, people who live through tragedy and carry that burden with them. As they retire, there's a concern that institutional knowledge will be lost, that new generations will have to relearn the same painful lessons. In schools across the United States, Christa McAuliffe's name remains especially resonant. Dozens of schools bear her name. The Christa McAuliffe Space Science Center in New Hampshire has educated hundreds of thousands of students about space. But her legacy goes deeper than the institutions bearing her name. She represented the idea that space is not just for technical elites, but for ordinary citizens, for teachers, for people who want to learn and share that learning. In 2007, NASA finally resumed the Teacher in Space program, which had been suspended after Challenger. The first teacher selected under the revived program, Barbara Morgan, had been Christa's backup in 1986. She flew on the Space Shuttle Endeavour in 2007, finally fulfilling the mission Christa had begun. "This is for Christa," Morgan said from space, teaching students on Earth. She believed teachers had a place in space, and she was right. Today, the idea of non-professional participants in spaceflight is increasingly common. Space tourists fly regularly. Artists, journalists, and ordinary people are experiencing space in ways Christa helped make possible. His death was tragic, but his vision survived. In a conference room at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, a heated debate is underway. It's 2025, and NASA is planning the Artemis mission, which will return humans to the moon for the first time since 1972. A group of engineers has identified a potential problem with the life support system. It's not a definitive problem, but rather an area of uncertainty. Test data is limited. Theoretically, it should work, but there are edge scenarios where it could fail. One side of the debate argues, we need more evidence, more data, more time. We can't risk a repeat of Challenger. The other side counters, we'll never have complete certainty. At some point, you have to trust your engineering and take flight. If we let the fear of failure paralyze us, we'll never get anywhere. It's the eternal dilemma of exploration. How do you balance safety with progress? How do you know when you've done enough to mitigate risks? How do you distinguish between prudent caution and analysis paralysis? There are no easy answers. After Challenger, NASA became so cautious that some argued it had gone too far in the opposite direction, delaying missions over minor concerns. But Columbia demonstrated that vigilance cannot be relaxed. That complacency is always waiting to creep in. What we learned from Challenger, says one safety director, is that you have to listen to the voices of concern, especially when they're uncomfortable. But we also learn from the aftermath that you can't let fear paralyze you. It's a delicate balance. The meeting continues for hours. Eventually, it is decided to conduct additional tests, but not to delay the entire mission. It's a compromise, and no one is completely satisfied. But it reflects a hard-won organizational maturity. By the mid-2020s, NASA and several private companies are seriously planning manned missions to Mars. It's the next major leap in human space exploration. But Mars is months away from Earth. A mission would take years. The risks are exponentially greater than anything attempted before. There's no quick escape if something goes wrong. There's no rescue possible. Astronauts who eventually go to Mars will do, so knowing they might not return. It's a level of risk that makes even shuttle flights seem relatively safe. How do you reconcile that with the lessons learned from Challenger? How do you justify sending people on missions where the probability of fatal failure isn't 1 in 100,000, but perhaps 1 in 10? The answer, proponents argue, is that the risk must be voluntarily accepted by fully informed participants. The Challenger astronauts were aware of the general risks of spaceflight, but they weren't fully informed about the specific problems with the O-rings. That was the critical ethical flaw. For Mars, says one mission planner, we will be absolutely transparent about every known risk. Astronauts will make an informed decision. And if we lose a crew on Mars, it will be tragic, but it won't be because we ignored warnings or misled people about the dangers. It's an important distinction. The Challenger wasn't simply an unfortunate accident. It was a result of decisions that prioritized schedule over known safety caveats. That's what made it particularly reprehensible. Not everyone agrees that more human space exploration is worthwhile. There are respectable and thoughtful voices that argue that we should focus on robotic exploration and solving problems on Earth. We have climate change, poverty, massive inequality, argues one activist, and we're spending billions sending people to Mars. What's the real priority? It's a legitimate question, and after Challenger, it gained significant political traction. Why risk lives when robots can do the job? Proponents of human spaceflight counter that exploration isn't just about data collection. It's about inspiration, about pushing human boundaries, about ensuring that humanity isn't confined to a single vulnerable planet. Challenger shouldn't make us give up on exploration, says one advocate. It should make us do it better, safer, smarter, but it shouldn't stop us. It's a debate that will never be fully resolved because it depends on fundamental values. What price are we willing to pay for exploration? How much risk is acceptable? What Challenger taught us definitively is that risk must be respected, not denied. That decision-makers must be honest about the dangers. That warning voices must be heeded, not silenced. Within that framework, reasonable people may disagree about whether to proceed, but the decision-making process must be ethical. It's January 28, 2026. Exactly 40 years since the Challenger exploded. The morning is clear at Cape Canaveral, but not as bitterly cold as that day in 1986. At the Challenger Memorial at the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex, a crowd has gathered. They are families of the astronauts, now with grandchildren of their own, NASA veterans with gray hair and canes, young students from Christa McAuliffe High School, reporters covering the anniversary. June Scobie Rogers, now 90, is too frail to attend, but sends a video message. 40 years old, she says, her voice quavering with age. My Dick would have been 86 now. I think of all the moments we missed. But I also think of how proud he would be of how NASA learned from his death, of how the space program continued. That would have meant the world to him. Scott McAuliffe, now 49, speaks on behalf of his family. My mother was 37 when she died, he says. I'm older now than she was, and I wonder what she would have accomplished had she lived. But I know this. She inspired a generation of young people, especially girls, to dream about space. That legacy lives on. A group of aerospace engineering students from Purdue University, where Neil Armstrong studied, present a project they developed, a hypothetical redesign of the shuttle's escape system that could have saved them. It's an academic exercise, of course. The shuttle was retired long ago, but it symbolizes something important, that new generations are learning from the tragedy, thinking about how to do things better. As the sun sets over Cape Canaveral on this 40th anniversary, lights are turned on at the memorial. 7 beams of light point toward the night sky, one for each lost astronaut. Families gather quietly. Some talk, sharing memories. Others simply gaze at the lights, lost in thought. A boy, perhaps 8 years old, asks his father, "Why did you go into space if it was so dangerous?" The father thinks for a moment before answering. Because exploring is what makes us human. Because they wanted to learn, to discover, to push beyond what was known. And because they dreamed of a future where space was accessible to all of us. The boy nods, not fully understanding yet. But one day he will. The stars shine above them, indifferent to human tragedies, eternal and unreachable, but a little less unreachable than they were. Every mission, every experiment, Every lesson learned brings us a little closer. The Challenger and its crew were part of that journey. They paid the ultimate price. But their contribution was not in vain. In safer rockets flying today, in the safety culture, now entrenched in the space industry, in the generations of engineers who learned that professional integrity is worth more than pleasing their bosses, in the millions of students inspired by the story of a teacher who dreamed of teaching from the stars. The Challenger's legacy isn't the explosion, although that image is forever etched in the collective memory. The legacy is the lessons learned, the lives changed, the futures inspired. And as long as humanity continues to look up, as long as we continue to reach for the stars despite the risks, as long as we honor those who came before by remembering both their triumphs and their tragedies, the Challenger 7 will not be forgotten. Scobie, Smith, Resnick, McNair, Onizuka, Jarvis, McAuliffe, 7 names, 7 lives, a mission that ended in tragedy but left a lasting legacy. The lights point toward the sky. The crowd gradually disperses. Families return to their homes, carrying with them memories both sweet and bitter. And somewhere, on a launch pad under construction, a new rocket waits, designed with the lessons of the past, preparing to take the next generation of explorers to the stars. The journey continues, and those we lost along the way still guide us, not with their presence, but with their lessons. Heaven still calls to them, and we respond, wiser for their sacrifice, humbler for their loss, but still driven by the same impulse that led them, to explore, to discover, to reach beyond. Challenger wasn't the end. It was a painful chapter in a larger story, a story that continues to be written, launch after launch, mission after mission. And as we look ahead to Mars, to the moons of Jupiter, to the stars beyond, we carry with us the names of those who did not complete the journey, so that we never forget, so that their deaths were not in vain, so that the future we build is worthy of the price they paid. 73 seconds. 7 lives. An eternal legacy. This is the story of the Challenger. Not just how it failed, but why it mattered, of the people behind the headlines, of the lessons we paid so dearly to learn, of the dreams that survived the tragedy. 40 years later, heaven still calls to us. And when we answer, we will do so with the wisdom gained from those 73 seconds that changed everything. May they rest in peace, the Challenger 7. And may their names always remind us that exploration comes at a price, that safety must be sacred, and that some dreams are worth the risk, but only if we honor those who pay the price.